Just to give you a heads up, that when I was reading this, I was like, I don't really know which way this person's leaning with this, but I will say that I think this person writing this article thinks that Brian Kohberger is guilty. However, they still think that the information that the defence are requesting should be handed over, because they are fed up with the inequality and the between the state and the defence, and with the with this parallel construction, with the concealing of how things are done. But that's just my opinion. Tell me what you think. I mean, they definitely think that the information should be handed over, but I get the impression that they actually think he's guilty. Let me know what you think. I don't know if I'm misconstruing it, or maybe they're more on the fence than I realise, but this is the impression I get, and I was quite surprised further on that this person was then advocating for the fact that they think information should be handed over and everything should be open. At the end of the day, it's the judge who decides what is entered into court, not the prosecution, who seem to be acting as gatekeepers. Right, a legal battle behind closed doors may be the most important and consequential legacy of the identification and prosecution of Brian Kohberger for the murders of 4 University of Idaho students in November 2022. The state is fighting the defence discovery motion with regard to the use of forensic genetic genealogy during the investigation, claiming it is outside the scope of the discovery statute and immaterial to the defence, and in doing so has confirmed its use. I expect the defence to file, now this was in June by the way, a more specific motion to compel and to argue vigorously that disclosure is in fact vital to their case. I'm just making a cup of tea, I hope you don't mind whilst I read. The judge's ruling may well determine how this case is both prosecuted and defended, with legal reverberations to future cases in which genetic genealogy is used to develop suspects. It certainly will affect how the case is covered, how the investigation is memorialised in books and documentaries, and may finally lead to the general public understanding that law enforcement narratives often contain omissions and a quasi-legal retrofitting known as parallel construction. That Brian Kohberger was identified as a suspect by forensic or investigative genetic genealogy has been an open secret for months. The New York Times wrote a full reported article on June 10th, a week after I posted this piece. Their investigative timeline differs from my composite below. They have actual inside sources. Article is linked below and well worth reading for the breadth of data requested in search warrants from entirely innocent people. I'll put the link to this article in the description. The affidavit for Kohberger's arrest, replete with a gripping narrative of chronological cause and effect police work is largely a fiction in the way a glowing profile of a young, successful entrepreneur might omit the fact they have a gigantic trust fund. In fact, the investigation was stalled and would not have been solved without the minuscule amount of touched DNA on the knife sheath Kohberger left near his first victims and genetic genealogy. The prosecution can and does leave investigative steps out of probable cause affidavits, and PCAs can be written in a way that implies a chronology of investigative steps and obscures the chaotic and multi-pronged swirl of simultaneous methods and processing of leads. This is called parallel construction. Parallel construction is a law enforcement process of building a parallel or separate evidentiary basis for a criminal investigation in order to conceal how an investigation actually began. Obtained from Wikipedia, no less. To some extent, parallel construction is a giant lie of omission. A lie by way of omission, indeed. The prosecution likely would prefer not to present witnesses and evidence regarding forensic genealogy at trial because it adds complexity and is less specific than evidence they subsequently developed. There is also currently a massive behind-the-scenes scrum among law enforcement, the legal community and the genealogy community about the use of genetic genealogy in active versus cold cases. The FBI, which has stood up its own genetic genealogy lab, specifically instructs police not to mention its use in arrest affidavits and legal filings. The argument is that it is merely a tip or a lead or a technique that once the suspect's actual DNA is gathered and other supporting evidence is amassed, is both irrelevant and a distraction. More to the point, there are moral, legal and privacy rights ramifications to the increasingly widespread use of ordinary Americans' genetic material, and the backlash may well hamstring law enforcement going forward. The moral quagmire, the moral quagmire and lack of legal boundaries is well exemplified in a recent case where a rape victim's DNA gathered from her forensic exam was used subsequently to link her to and charge her with an unrelated crime. Meanwhile, for the defence, the idea that this process of developing suspects is exempt from discovery and cross-examination when all other investigative procedures, processes, tips, leads, personnel, reports, etc. are not, even if they proved fruitless or are not used in trial by the prosecution, is absurd and smacks of a kind of unconstitutional secrecy, treading on the Sixth Amendment right, I thought it was the Fourth Amendment, to a fair trial and the right to confront evidence. There are excellent articles and videos on forensic genetic genealogy online, as well as a fascinating, extremely well done podcast on the first crime solved with the technique, the Bear Brook podcast. The Bear Brook podcast uncovered an unknown serial killer, after which the same genealogist was tapped to identify the Golden State Killer. Was that C.C. Moore? Oh no, I think she was involved in the Idaho one. But briefly, crime scene DNA that cannot be matched in CODIS, the nationwide law enforcement DNA database, is subjected to a different extractive process and then uploaded to Family Tree DNA and or GEDmatch, the two commercial databases where users can opt in to law enforcement comparisons. Distant relatives of the person who left the DNA at the crime scene are identified, and then a genealogist reverse engineers a family tree that will include that person. Law enforcement then looks at the likely suspects within that family tree, narrowing by location, age, criminal history, etc. The final step is to directly obtain suspect DNA for a match, which is often done surreptitiously. I'm going to link an episode, and I cannot remember, I keep forgetting the name of this YouTube channel. Something to do with presumption. It's two defence attorneys, and then there's another guy who's in it who barely says anything, and I don't even know what his role is. But he just occasionally says something witty, but not very often. But they had CC Moore on there, and it was really interesting. She's obviously a genealogist, and I think she was the genealogist involved in the Angie Dodge case, which was in Idaho, and the murder was in 1996. The wrong guy, Chris Tapp, was convicted and was in prison for 20 plus years, and then he was released, and then there was genetic genealogy. They got this DNA. They got DNA that didn't match to this guy. They knew it didn't match to him, but he still went to prison. Then they tested it. Well done. And they used genetic genealogy, and then they got the wrong guy again. And it was a guy called Michael Usry Jr. And I've done a video on him. It's quite a few videos back. I'll put it into the description as well. And then this guy, they actually did get a warrant to get his DNA. They didn't just go rifling through his bins like they apparently did with Koberger. Or, I mean, really, did they get it on this traffic stop? Who knows? Oh, sorry about that. I hate these doors. They're annoying. Annoyingly startling. And then he had to wait weeks or a month or something, shitting himself basically, even though he must have known that he wasn't guilty, but he had to wait a month for them to decide whether he was guilty or not. But you don't know, do you? They could just stitch you up like a kipper. And anyway, they said, no, it's not you. You can go about your business. This guy was like a horror filmmaker as well. He made like slasher films. Then it turns out it was a flipping neighbour across the road or something. And the thing is, they really had kind of insisted that it was a young man. And this guy, he wasn't old, but he was in his 30s. And these guys were young, and they just decided, with both Chris Tapp and Michael Usry, they would have been about 19 at the time, and they decided it was somebody of that sort of age. And, you know, they focused there. And so when they're doing the DNA profile, that's who they're focusing on, somebody that age. But anyway, turns out it was somebody, you're not going to believe this. Well, if you're American, it might not, this joke might not work so well. But so Chris Tapp is the guy who's originally fingered for it. But the guy that apparently actually did it and is now in prison for it is Brian Dripp. So it doesn't work so well if you call taps faucets, though. Or call faucets. Yeah, we call faucets taps, or do you call taps faucets? Which came first, the faucet or the tap? Anywho, yeah. So then Brian Dripp, I think it was CC Moore that was involved in the genetic genealogy in that case. You just hope they got the right person with Brian Dripp. But apparently, Brian Dripp, I read in one article, is related. So they're not saying they got the family tree wrong. They said that he's related to Michael Usry. But they spelt Michael Usry's last name wrong in that article. And then I look at Brian Dripp and find that he is related to an Usry, but it is an Usry that's spelt differently. So did somebody just fuck it up with spelling, like spelling the name wrong, and so they're going chasing the wrong person? I don't know, and it can't work like that, can it? But I just don't know. Like I'm like, were they actually related? Like, so it was. Turned out it was apparently somebody related to Michael Usry, but very distantly. Apparently. I don't even know why I'm talking about this. Oh yeah, I was going to put that CC Moore's. So I'll have to put what time she starts. It's about halfway through that she's introduced, so she's not in the beginning, and I'll put the time on when she's being interviewed. But I mean, you might want to watch all of it. It is interesting, I think. So, a close reading of the probable cause affidavit for Kohberger's arrest reveals a subtext, almost invisible ink of a parallel secret investigation. The key to understanding why it is likely that investigative genetic genealogy first brought Kohberger's name into the investigation is the White Elantra, and more specifically, when and why the FBI analyst expanded his expert opinion from 2011 to 2013 models to 2011 to 2016 models. Why is the Elantra the key? 2 reasons. Number 1, I just want to see if this tea is hot, or it might be too hot for me. I'm so sorry, I'm a slurper. Oh dear. Well, it's a bit hot, that's why. Let me just put a bit of cold in. Why did the WSU... I mean, you'd have thought I could have done this before or after, wouldn't you? But I don't know, sorry. I'll try not to slip. Why did the WSU officers immediately search for and find Kohberger's car in the parking lot within the hour of finding it in their database? Good question. I'm changing my mind about what I don't know what I was thinking last night. They seem quite... Maybe the worm turns. There was reporting that there were 90 white Elantras registered at Idaho State alone. Do they mean at Idaho State University? No, it's not called Idaho State University. Because they say at Idaho State, not in Idaho State. Idaho State University is in Boise, isn't it? So why did this car get immediate action? And 2, at the point where Moscow police asked fellow law enforcement to keep an eye out for white Elantras, it was specifically for the 2011 to 13 model, which Kohberger did not have. Logically, and the defence would have immediately noticed this and circled this part of the affidavit with a big red pen, metaphorically speaking, Moscow police already had Kohberger's name. Another reason to believe, investigative genealogy was used is that although the affidavit is written as though the camera footage of the car's journey was pieced together contemporaneously, it clearly was not. That is because they had zero footage after he left Moscow heading south. You can see in the affidavit that his path and time of travel immediately after the murders was only determined from cell phone pings after they got the expanded Verizon data on December the 23rd, well after they had his name. When did they have his name? Because he was arrested 29th, wasn't it? But when was it that they actually had his name? Does anybody know? Here's my hypothesis on the sequence of events. They identify suspect vehicle 1 via local King Street camera footage and are able to track it coming into the neighbourhood, circling around and leaving at 4:20. They do not get the licence plate number, but they do notice it has no front plate. Simultaneously, they find the sheath right away and understand this is a key piece of evidence because, unlike searching for the murderer's blood, which will take a long time given the sheer amount of blood evidence to be processed, the sheath most likely belongs to the murderer and is likely to have his DNA unless he used gloves every single time he handled it from point of acquisition, which I think somebody would, especially if they ordered it off Amazon. They would take it out wearing gloves to check that it was what they wanted, and then they put it back in the packaging and they'd keep it in the packaging until they used it, I think. They'd even have it in their glove box in the packaging, I think. I also bet that from decades of experience, the FBI knows that criminals know to wipe down weapons but miss key parts, and such a key part on a sheath is the interior crevice of a sheath snap. So I thought they were saying here that they knew to look there. They knew, oh, that's a good place to check for DNA, because even if you wiped it, sometimes it can still be within that crevice. But are they saying they knew that was a good place to say that it was, even if it wasn't? I'm not sure what this person's saying. They send the sheath to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab for testing, and a single source of DNA is identified. Single source is huge. But they say, I'm sure it says single source of male DNA. But that doesn't mean, but that could be a mixture, couldn't it, of male and female? Because they're saying single source of male DNA. So they're not saying single source of DNA, I don't think. Unless I need to check that PCA. They fast track identifying it. It's not in CODIS, the nationwide DNA base of convicted felons. Meanwhile, the FBI analyst has given his opinion that the video footage shows a white 2011 to 13 Elantra. Moscow police decide to try genetic genealogy. The rumour mill keeps mentioning a specialised lab in Texas, and this is almost certainly Othram. They submit this single profile to the two databases where people have consented to police access. They get a hit on a relative, and I think fairly close relative because of the speed. Well, C.C. Moore said that she doesn't think that they could have done that because his family hails back to Italy, I think, and because she's checked out his family tree, and she said it's really complicated, and she thought that they wouldn't have got a hit on a close relative straight away. They would have, would have taken them. It would have been taken a long time and would have been complicated. A genealogist works up a family tree and identifies a set of names of men. The DNA is male within a certain age range probably worked up. But the thing I don't like is that they just used Y DNA, didn't they? And I know in the Golden State Killer case, they used autosomal DNA. And I think that's what's generally being used in active cases. Sorry, not active cases. In that's not an active case, cold case. In cases where somebody, so not in missing person cases, that's what I mean. In criminal cases. My bad. Police use public and law enforcement databases to query those men. See my July the 2nd addenda below for the fishy shenanigans behind the scenes in this case. Remember that Koberger was on the WSU Criminology PhD website with a picture. Koberger also comes up in law enforcement databases for 2 local traffic stops. Now things are happening fast and simultaneously. I'll tell you what I think they've done. I don't think the genetic genealogy is the thing that's being hidden, because it hasn't been hidden, and I think that they've allowed it to be leaked out, and I think this thing's being hidden, and everybody's going to call me some kind of crazy conspiracy theorist, but I think what's being hidden is use of facial recognition, unless they've just done it dodgy with this, but the use of facial recognition tech. Because if they knew that car went to if they managed to work out that car that they saw, or thought it was the same car, whether it was or it wasn't, went to a supermarket, and they managed to get some grainy footage, then they may have then used facial recognition. Oh, well, then that would mean it definitely was him, though. God, I'm not sorry. Oh, okay, maybe it was him. Okay, my argument is, well, maybe it was. I don't know. I can stick by my argument. I'll send a man to the firing squad. I've got to be right. No, I don't mean that. Somebody's dropping things upstairs. I'm just going to shut up now and carry on. This person's they know what they're talking about. Right. They have found a person whose local fits the eyewitness description. Because what I was thinking, this is what I was thinking, is that they could have got footage of him at the supermarket. Sometimes I don't know what I'm thinking. I can't figure it out in my own brain. It gets all muddled. So say they have footage of him at the supermarket and he's wearing a mask at the supermarket, and they show it to Dylan, and this is where the mask comes in, and they say to her, was this person wearing a mask? And maybe she's made up that there was a person there at all, but because they found somebody and they were wearing a mask, she says yes, they were wearing a mask, because otherwise she couldn't really identify somebody if they're in the supermarket not wearing a mask. And the more likely place that you would wear a mask is in a supermarket. Some people still do that, and I can imagine Brian Koberger being the kind of person who would do that. But you can't identify somebody if they're wearing a mask. I don't know. It's not fully formed in my mind what I feel like I'm going somewhere with this, but I'm not I haven't fully worked out where I'm going. But let's stick with this person at the moment. They have found a person who is local, fits the eyewitness description, and drives a white Elantra with Pennsylvania plates. And Pennsylvania does not use front plates. But his Elantra is the wrong year, according to the FBI expert. They go back to the expert, get him to revise his opinion. They find a way to get WSU to locate the car without directly asking for his name. And now that they know where he lives and works, they pull WSU and Pullman camera footage to construct the beginning and end of his journey on the morning of November 13th. They supplement and bolster this with cell phone pings once they receive those from Verizon in December, which also allows a reconstruction of his route south on the following day, and thence actual video footage of Koberger in a grocery store. I'd be very interested to read the subpoena for phone records to Verizon. What probable cause was given? The whole question of when and how to approach him was probably hotly debated. Now they have probable cause, but he has already left on his road trip to Pennsylvania. I don't think he was already being tracked, because remember about that time in an interview, Chief Fry sort of slips up and said, "We don't know where the suspect is," then quickly added, "We don't know who he is." They do get a hit from a license plate reader in Colorado, and then the two visual confirmation they knew where he lived, and they knew where his address, and they didn't notice that he'd left, that he'd gone. Didn't they put a watch on his address? Then the two visual confirmation traffic stops in Indiana. Do you know one thing I noticed? And it's probably, I'm sure it's completely irrelevant, and there are a lot of people who don't look like their dad, but he doesn't look anything like his dad, does he? Not in the slightest. I can't see any family resemblance whatsoever. And the irony of his dad's DNA being the thing that got him, he literally looks absolutely nothing like him. Made me wonder if he wasn't even his dad, if he was because we haven't really seen them, have we? They haven't been seen like speaking publicly. Made me wonder if he's actually a lawyer or something like that, or somebody else. He's not his actual dad. I mean, he could be. There are plenty of people who don't look like their dad. My brother-in-law doesn't look anything like his dad. So I suppose it's just some people just don't. Because they're genetics, they just don't have. They have more of a genetic influence from their mum. How interesting. Despite exclusive denials, but that's another thing with dads, isn't it? Like, dads could easily not be the dad. Do you know what I mean? But then the dad must be the dad if they've used the dad's DNA, then checked his DNA. I think they're better off relying on mums. Despite exclusive denials autosomal is both, isn't it? I think so. I'm pretty sure. What was I listening to? It was the court. It was in court. I'm pretty sure that she said in court, autosomal is the one that's basically, it's got everything in it. Why would you use a technique which only focuses on one side of your family? I don't understand. Despite exclusive denials to Dateline, these were obviously requested Sorry, let me go back a bit. They do get a hit from a license plate reader in Colorado, and then the two visual confirmation traffic stops in Indiana. Despite exclusive denials to Dateline, those were obviously requested pretext stops with plausible deniability. I think they were, and I think they were trying to obtain DNA. It's clear he's headed home for the holidays. They still need confirmation of his actual DNA matching the sheath sample. There has been at least one case where a suspect identified through genetic genealogy and who was in the right place and the right time and with the right age was not a DNA match to the evidence and was completely not involved in the crime. I think they might be talking about Michael Usry there. Coincidences do happen. They likely had been trying to get discarded DNA from him through early December with no luck and had to settle for his family's trash, hoping for his, but instead getting his father's. I think that he knew that they were onto him, because I think that's why his dad flew over there and drove with him, and maybe that's why he was not throwing stuff out, because he had a feeling of what was going on. I feel like he knew something was going on. It doesn't necessarily mean he was guilty, but it means that they must have done something that made him realise what was going on. Maybe he works for the CIA. He's anyway, continuing on. Of course he works for the CIA. Hoping for his, but instead getting his father's, which is sufficiently... I started off so sensible when I started reading this, and I'm just getting a bit silly now. I'm going to try and pull myself together. But instead, getting his father's, which is sufficiently dispositive. After the arrest, they promptly collected his DNA directly to match the knife sheath. The identification of the DNA, I'm going to put something else in here. I'm going to remember to do it this time because I don't think I did on another video. But I watched a video of this forensics guy, and he he did this kind of... it was a kind of seminar talk kind of thing, and he exemplified how different professionals different labs basically, and there's been studies done on this, that different labs come to different conclusions on the same DNA. That's crazy, isn't it? So, and his point was that it's not as objective as everybody thinks it is. There is subjectivity to it. There is confirmation bias involved. I mean, it's not necessarily the case in this case, but it could be. The identification of the DNA, and when there's more pressure, it can be worse, which there would be an enormous amount of pressure here. You better tell me that DNA is the right DNA. I mean that DNA. The identification of the DNA from the Koberger family trash as belonging to the father of the person whose DNA was left on the knife sheath took just one day. That's because it is a commonplace process called familial DNA available to any decent crime lab. However, multiple writers and true crime YouTubers, I hope you're not going to be rude to us, have mistaken this. This is where she got under my skin, or he, I don't know if it's a she or he writing this, have mistaken this final step prior to Koberger's arrest as genetic genealogy, and confusion reigns. No, I don't think people did they? No, we knew that it got compared to the actual, but what people, I think, are querying more than anything, many people think that some people think that it was placed there, and other people think that it could have been transferred. Anyway, let's carry on. I'd call out most egregiously the author Howard Bloom, who is writing a book on the case, a book destined to read like pulp. This is where I feel like the worm turned. destined to read like pulp law enforcement fanfic and to bear absolutely no resemblance to the actual investigation, the actual legal process, or any person living or dead. Anyhow, for the defence, they can probe the investigative sequence to reveal that Kohberger was the target early on, around November the 29th. The New York Times placed this, at December the 19th. They can drill down on when and why the model of car identification was expanded and accuse investigators of retrofitting evidence to their theory, a type of tunnel vision. They can ask why the call was put out for 2011 to 2013 Elantras, even after Kohberger was identified. Was that simply cover for the fact they had already closed other investigative avenues? I absolutely want the judge to rule in favour of the defence and for the prosecution to fully disclose the who, what, where, when and where of the genetic genealogy piece of the investigation. I'm extremely interested in actual, granular investigations as opposed to heroic narratives or glib parallel constructions. I'm interested in fact-based coverage and discussions. I think the more charged an event or issue, the more vital it is to adhere to the truth. Much more importantly, law enforcement has used parallel construction to obscure the actual source of critical evidence from view for decades. This practice denies defendants and defence attorneys multiple avenues to challenge the admissibility of evidence, the credibility of informants, and the legality of hidden aspects of the investigation. I have experienced this on a small scale directly myself. A few years ago, I provided a tip to law enforcement that directly initiated an investigation leading to an arrest. In the 2 media reports of this arrest, I was bemused to read the lead investigator claiming my tip as a result of her own effort. I believe this was done to protect me, but to see that I was entirely erased from information that I, and only I, had handed to them, in my exact words, was eye-opening. It happens all the time. Addenda. How long's the addenda? I think I'm going to sneeze. Ooh, more of a snuff. Right, not too long. We'll go with that. But if you need to go, you need to go, and it will be in the description if you would like to read this bit at a later date. So, July the 2nd, addenda. I've only ever seen it called an addendum. I've never seen an addenda before. The defence did indeed file a spicy motion accusing the prosecution of hiding the football. The motion adroitly pointed out that the probable cause affidavit for Kohberger's arrest omitted all mention of investigative genetic genealogy, while multiple investigative steps and search warrants were clearly subsequent to its use and relied upon it. There is a hint of possible fruit of the poisonous tree issues. More ominous is the expanded motion to suppress by the state, which casually reveals that A, while the knife sheath DNA was sent to a private lab to generate the SNP profile and begin to construct a family tree, law enforcement decided to instead assign the work to the FBI, and B, the FBI uploaded the DNA profile to genealogy databases, received matches of relatives, constructed a family tree, identified Kohberger, and gave that tip to Idaho law enforcement, and then deleted the profile from the database and did not memorialise any of their work nor create a report. The state seeks to suppress the family tree itself, claiming it violates the privacy of the DNA informants. A new legal category which, if ratified by this judge, will have major consequences going forward. They also seek to exclude from discovery the identity of the private lab and all its work product. The extreme secrecy around this pivotal investigative work seems to me to indicate that something fishy is going on, and my hypothesis is that the private lab found very distant matches and began a family tree that was going to take a lot of painstaking, time-consuming work. That's what C.C. Moore said. The FBI then appropriated the DNA profile and did the work in-house and black box. I don't know what that means, but it sounds very cloak and dagger. And what I think they did was directly submit the profile to one or more of the public databases that does not allow law enforcement access without a warrant. I think the FBI submitted the sample as if they were a private citizen, using the product either Ancestry.com or 23andMe. Both of those companies have millions of DNA profiles in their databases versus exponentially fewer in the opt-in databases. That means the likelihood of getting a close relative match is much greater, and that is what I believe happened. Then the FBI deleted their work, closed the portal, and hid behind the legal constructs of tip and informant. The very reason that 23andMe and Ancestry.com, the biggest genealogical services, closed their databases to law enforcement in the first place was because of abuses and lack of transparency. In a case I link below, a completely innocent guy was brought in for custodial interrogation and his DNA taken by warrant after he was identified by genetic genealogy as a possible suspect. His father had submitted a DNA sample to a family tree project. I think they are talking about Michael Ussery again here, because he submitted his to a Mormon one. But apparently, Ancestry was actually originally a Mormon database. His father had submitted a DNA sample to a family tree project run by his own church, which, unbeknownst to him, ended up uploaded to one of the major genealogy databases. That service faced media blowback and prospective class action lawsuits and promptly adopted a policy of non-disclosure to law enforcement. If I'm right in my hypothesis, and I think Koberger's defence is also thinking along these lines, this thing is going to blow up on the prosecution and possibly change the legal landscape to allow defence discovery of investigative genetic genealogy going forward. We might even get one of those rare open court moments where a defence lawyer asks an FBI agent on the stand, which service did you submit the sample to? And they have to admit under oath that they circumvented the rules and possibly the law. Da, da, da. There we go. Right. I'm going to upload this to YouTube, and I'm going to put this here article in the description, and I will be back with more soon.